So today's tip is about the IELTS writing test. I've created a very simple checklist with the main requirements of both tasks, which you can use for the general training test and also for the academic test. And the idea behind this checklist is that you make sure you are doing everything you're supposed to do. What I'm going to do with this quick tutorial today is go over each one of the requirements very briefly. Um, and I'm also adding a link to the description of this video. So if you go to the description of this video, you should have a link of where you can download this checklist that I'm going to be presenting here for you today. So all you need to do is check out the video description and you will have everything that we're covering today as a PDF for you to use in your classroom if you're a teacher or in your self-studies if you're a student. So as you can see, I'm looking at the IELTS checklist here, and I want to go over the criteria that we're going to be covering very quickly with you, just so that you understand what's expected of you on the test and how you can do it. I'm adding a link to this post, so if you want to download this checklist for you to use with your students or for you to use in your self-studies, feel free to do it. You can have a teacher mark your test and then just go over what you've done. I think it's a very nice way for you to see what you're doing right. So let's go over each one of the criteria very briefly. Task achievement basically means, did this person answer what I asked? So it's very common for people who are starting to train for the IELTS to not know that on task one, you're actually not supposed to use your creativity. You're supposed to be objective and present accurate information. Accurate information means that everything you talk about in your writing needs to be on the test. So anything you mention, anything you discuss, any points that you bring up needs to be easily found in the question. Be careful. With the academic test, you're supposed to provide an overview. The overview is basically a paraphrase of the information from the question. So you will take the information from the question and you will rewrite it with different words in one sentence right at the beginning of your test. If you don't do this, it's very likely that your grade is going to suffer. Another thing you need to do for the academic writing test is highlighting key features of stages. What I mean by that is you need to have a paragraph where you talk about the most important things covered on that graph or on that map. So you're going to briefly talk about the main points of that you can identify on that writing without mentioning things that are not on the graph. If you mention things that cannot be seen on the graph, your grade will suffer. Every detail you provide needs to be supported with data. And by that, I mean, if I'm making a prediction that in the future something will happen, I need to have data in the graph that supports that. It can't simply be my opinion or what I think is going to happen. If you do that, your grade will suffer. And for the general training test, for task one, you need to address all points in the question. So that means you need to talk about all 3 bullet points that you're going to be presented with in your test. If you don't talk about one of them, your grade will suffer. If you add another bullet point because you think it's easier to talk about that, you are also going to be penalized. So you need to talk about exactly what you were asked. Be very careful about it. So that's task achievement. Following task achievement, we have what we call task response. Task response is the equivalent of task achievement for task number 2. Now, whether you're doing the general training test or the academic test, this writing is going to be the same. The expectation for task response is that, above all, you answered the question. A lot of students think that it's a good idea to kind of develop the argument and only provide an answer in the end. But I personally recommend that whenever you're asked to give an opinion, that you provide it right at the beginning of your text. Because by answering the question, you will have fulfilled a very important requirement. But if you have a beautifully written text and at the end of it you didn't provide an answer, your grade will suffer, and a lot. So make sure you answer the question. I personally like to do it in the first sentence of my text if I can. That allows me to have a clearer picture of what arguments I'm going to present, and it also limits me in the amount of contradictions that I can produce when I'm building my argument. Next criterion is, did this person give, support, and develop relevant points? What do I mean by that? Well, if you're if you are supposed to give your opinion, or if you have a point about something, you are supposed to present that point in the introduction and then paraphrase that point and develop it with supporting arguments in the development paragraph. And you are supposed to do this with the other point you have as well. If you don't support some points, or if you mention something in your introduction and then you don't talk about it, or if you don't really mention something in the introduction and then you kind of include it in your development paragraphs, it's going to seem like you didn't really develop your points in the correct way. So be careful about that. Be careful about presenting a point and then not talking about it, because your grade can suffer. If you mention something, you need to talk about it. If you can't build a connection between your points, try and exclude some of these points because your grade can suffer. Next, we have clearly stated a position. As I said, if you're asked to give your opinion, if you're asked to say what you think, don't just talk about both sides of the argument and not give your opinion. The clearer you are when you state your position, the better your grade will be. It's very common for students to see both pros and cons on both sides of the arguments and then end up not really giving their opinion. And if you're asked to do so, you will lose a lot of points on your task response. So this is something to really watch out for. Coherence and cohesion means that your ideas are well connected to one another. It means that you don't just give your examiner a list of a lot of different points, that you can identify where information is provided and how things are related to each other. If you're doing the academic test, coherence and cohesion will, one of the ways to produce it is to paraphrase the question in one paragraph. So you paraphrase the question, rewrite the question with your own words, and you talk about it. Very important if you're doing writing task 1 to have separate paragraphs for the overview, and then a separate paragraph for key features and a separate paragraph for details. So if you write everything in one paragraph, your grade will suffer. It's not going to be cohesive. Writing task number 1 is all about an academic analysis. And what we do when we provide results of an analysis is provide each finding that we've had on a separate paragraph. So that's why you're supposed to have separate paragraph. With the general training test, you have to write one paragraph per bullet point. So that means each paragraph of your letter should cover one of the points you've been provided. Now, thinking of writing task 2, one of the expectations is that you will have an introductory paragraph, 2 development paragraphs, or 3 if you want. I personally recommend 2, but if you want to do 3, up to you, and a conclusion. It's very important that your introduction doesn't get turned into a development paragraph. I see that happen a lot with students. They start developing ideas in the introduction, and then when you look at the whole text, you clearly see that there isn't really an introductory paragraph. So in the introductory paragraph, you're supposed to briefly mention the 2 sides of your argument and provide a position if you're asked to. And then once you've done that, you will develop your arguments in the development paragraphs. So things like your examples and supporting ideas, they should come in the development paragraphs. And most important of all, your development paragraphs need to have a topic sentence. The topic sentence is the introductory sentence that tells your reader what your text is about. If you don't do that, your examiner's probably going to grade you down. So be careful. There's a comma missing here. I'm going to fix it soon. And then, as I said, provided 2 main points in the introduction. So you provide the 2 main points that prove that your point of view is correct in the introduction, and then you start each paragraph with the argument that with each one of those arguments, and then you provide supporting ideas after you provide the topic. Don't start a paragraph with an example unless that's the topic of your whole paragraph. It's very common for students to start a paragraph providing an example of something, and then they start talking about something which is not necessarily related. You lack a topic sentence, which means your grade is going to be lower. So start each sentence with start each paragraph with a topic sentence. That's very important. Next, we have lexical resource. Lexical resource basically means your vocabulary. It basically means how you use different words. So you're expected to use a range of words and paraphrases. You're expected to present your idea in the introduction, and then when you're developing, to say the same thing with different words and to use a range of words and phrases. They want to see you use collocations, so word combinations that go well together. You're going to be graded on spelling. They're going to see if you're using linking words and if you're using them correctly. Now, a big difference between the IELTS test and a lot of tests that we do in school is that you don't lose 0.1 points for every spelling mistake that you make. So you can make a lot of small spelling mistakes and still get a good grade because you only get penalized for that type of mistake once. And as I said before, coherence and cohesion and task response and task achievement are, I would say, even more important than spelling words correctly. So don't get hung up on spelling that much. If you look that you've made a lot of small spelling mistakes, just know you're not going to lose 0.5 and be on a lower band because of spelling necessarily. And the last criterion is grammar, range, and accuracy. So here They want to see if you use sentence structures well, if you can use different verb tenses, but not just for the sake of having a different verb tense there, but if you can use the appropriate verb tense in your writing, if you can use good punctuation, that type of thing. What I usually recommend to students is to avoid using complex structures unless you're very confident about what you're doing. So if you're using things like passive voice, for example, it might be better to not use it if you're not 100% confident on how to do it. And as I said, using a range of structures and a range of tenses doesn't necessarily mean complicating your writing. It means to use language that's simple, that's direct, and that's correct. So make sure you keep that in mind because that will be very important in your test. So this is a very simple checklist that I've come up with. I'm going to be sharing this as a PDF so you can use for your studies. If there's anything you'd like to ask me or anything that you would like to know, please send me a message. I hope this is useful. Bye bye.